Welcome to the Inkling and EDUCE Group co-hosted webinar, The Post-Pandemic Normal, Will Classroom Learning Survive? Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes. The webinar will run approximately 45 minutes with about 10 minutes of Q&A time at the end. The recording will be made available to all attendees after it concludes. As the audience, you are welcome to view the presentation slides provided with the slide widget at the bottom of the bar. You will be able to submit questions for the Q&A through the On24 widget. Please feel free to explore the additional widgets at the bottom, such as the media player functions, the social media activities, and other assets, and take the survey at the end to let us know how we did.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Ben Willis, and I'm responsible for strategy and alliances here at Inkling. I'm delighted to be joined by Nyla Reed, who is founding partner at the EDUCE Group, one of the many talented partners that make up the Inkling partner community. Nyla has more than 20 years of experience in the world of learning and, in her role at EDUCE, specializes in the implementation and adoption of learning and talent management technologies and strategies for large, complex organizations.
The inability to conduct classroom training this year has forced many of us into a situation of identifying immediate alternatives and asking whether the era of instructor-led training, or ILT, has come to an end. But this is not the first time ILT has been pronounced dead. By the late 1990s, learning management systems had become prevalent in corporate America, which led to the explosion of e-learning capabilities throughout the 2000s. Many at that point thought this would surely lead to the death of instructor-led training, but it didn't. Instead, both forms of learning continue to coexist, although some would argue that not enough thought was given to how they were brought together. We find ourselves at a similar crossroads today, where the emergence of COVID-19 is forcing organizations worldwide to rethink and reimagine how they will deliver learning initiatives, including considering how they will approach digital transformation. Many of you have been early adopters and thought leaders along this journey. For some, the session may be about how you can take the best of what you've already built and leverage it going forward. For others, you may be looking for ways to assist peers down this new path. Inkling tends to live at the intersection of learning and operations, so whether you look after one or both, our hope is that there is something here for everyone.
To rewind a bit, though, it's probably safe to say that for most people, 2020 started out as an exciting year full of hope and promise. But today, if we asked you how your year is going, we're guessing you might respond a bit more like this. Or perhaps a bit more like this. What is certain is that 2020 has been a year of big changes and broad uncertainty that has impacted all of us in ways many of us never could have imagined. Looking around at all of this change and impact, it's easy to become a bit discouraged and frustrated. Whether you're a part of a traditional learning organization or you're tasked with ensuring that operations run smoothly, our worlds have been turned upside down. But not to worry. If we look at these changes in a broader context, we feel there are many good reasons to be hopeful. In many ways, when we think about ILT in particular, it's not that something great is no longer possible. It's more likely that something flawed is in the process of being redefined. To begin this conversation, let me turn it over to Nyla.
Thanks, Ben. Before we jump into our discussion about the future of learning, let's first look at the evolution of communication. Remember when letters were the main way to communicate? I remember back in high school, I had lots of friends who went to camp over the summer. The only way to communicate with them was through letters sent through the mail. We would write a letter, drop it in the mailbox, and then look forward to receiving a response days, weeks, or sometimes even months later. We also remember when phones were plugged into walls and multiple people in a household had to share a single line. We went through major change as we started typing messages on computers and adopting email, and as we took calls anytime, anywhere on our cell phones. For each step in this transformation, there is a specific equation of things that were gained as well as things given up to create the way we see communication today. For example, we quickly adapted to the idea of getting immediate responses through email. We didn't have to wait for email to be delivered. It just popped up into our inbox. But conversely, we also lost our 9-to-5 day as we started taking cell phone calls in our cars on the way to work, during dinner, and at our kids' sporting events. All these things, both good and bad, combine to create the way we experience communication today. We are in a similar transformation today. While many are saying that the end of traditional instructor-led training has been thrust upon us, the truth is traditional ILT has already been experiencing pressure on many fronts. Let's take a look. Internally, corporations have been reducing travel budgets. You need to come up with a business justification to fly around for training. In addition, more people are responsible for developing training. And the people developing content are not necessarily instructional designers or training facilitators. They are the subject matter experts that know how things should be done, but do not have the background that instructional designers bring to the table. It's a different set of people that we are leaning on for delivery of training and ensuring employee performance. From a learner perspective, our employees are coming to the workplace with different expectations. Now, I think the Netflix analogy may be really overplayed, but it doesn't make it untrue. Learners do want learning to be recommended to them based on other training they have completed, and they want to find learning resources and information when they need it. Meeting learner expectations in terms of delivering the consumerized experience they see in other facets of their life has become very important and a predominant request. More broadly, our industry continues to confront an accelerated pace of change. Information is outdated as quickly as it gets disseminated. In those situations, that makes ILT a lot less appealing. You can't bring everyone together again every time something changes. So add all of these situations evolving over time to contribute to what COVID basically decided for us. We were already experiencing many conditions that made classroom learning less effective, but the pandemic made the delivery of ILT impossible. It has essentially accelerated a change that was inevitable. Ben, what do you think?
Agreed, Nyla. And I think the shifting learner expectations piece is worth exploring in a bit more detail. Inkling CEO Jeff Carr recently did a webinar with Michael Rochelle at Brandon Hall on what we've begun calling the new Learner Manifesto. And I think it's worth looking at that to see if we are delivering, and if not, if we can use these COVID times as an opportunity to take our learning to the next level. The first element of this new Learner Manifesto is relevancy. It goes without saying that I want the learning content I'm given to be highly relevant. It should be tailored to me and my role. And it should be contextualized, meaning it may be valuable to separate traditional learning like IT security training and team building skills from the more mission-critical learning that is needed to run and drive the business on a day-to-day basis, making it very clear to learners where and how to find each. Just as importantly, learners want high accessibility. They want to be able to learn when, where, and how they want, including on their smartphones on the go. So not only does your mission-critical content need to automatically adapt to the device that they select, but getting to that content needs to be a breeze. Learners will not tolerate a complex login process, and once in, they want to be able to search and easily find exactly what it is that they need to do their jobs. Unfortunately, as yesterday's learning management systems have evolved into today's talent management systems, learners are now confronted with a sea of information that is not always relevant. From generic learning content to performance reviews to compensation plans and much more, all of this adds friction to the process that can easily hurt effective learning in the moment of need. Similarly, users want high engagement. Yesterday's content was designed for yesterday, not today. We've all experienced the pain of death by next button surrounding most corporate learning initiatives. Compare that with how we learn on the web, where we search for what we want to know, thumb scroll through the resulting content until we find what we need, maybe watch a video or otherwise engage with that content, then move on when we've learned what we need to know. Organizational learning needs to be equally easy to access and equally engaging. Lastly, learners want a single source of truth that is always current. They are done being trained in one place and then sent somewhere completely different when they need information to do their jobs in the moment of need. And they're highly frustrated to be working with always out-of-date content, a problem inherent in content formats like PDF, PowerPoint, and others. Unfortunately, most of the tools that we use to create and deliver e-learning content today are also part of the problem. Just like PowerPoint and PDF content is out of date the moment it is released, e-learning content like SCORM packages suffer from the same challenge, resulting in learning systems that are not trusted as a source of truth. To make matters worse, when learners do search in these systems, they are often taken to courses, not specific pages within the course that might contain their answers. Learners do not want answers locked away in e-learning courses.
So let's compare what learners want, as Ben just described, to what they typically get. With instructor-led training, the effectiveness of a class often depends on the instructor. We've all been in the situation where we see firsthand that the instructor determines whether the learner has a good or a bad experience. Let's look at the left end of the spectrum. With lecture, communication is one way. The instructor delivers a planned message without offering the opportunity for interactivity. Information is disseminated, and the expectation is that learners will take notes, retain information, and act based on what was provided. Next on the spectrum is discussion. With discussion, the instructor directs conversation, but learners have some level of participation. What we really want, though, is an experiential classroom where learners try things out through role play or other simulation activities. This type of in-class, authentic assessment allows for learners to try out a skill or technique you want them to use on the job. And it also allows for real-time feedback in a safe environment so that people have the ability to run through things before they have to perform a task in the workplace, on the floor, or in another real-life situation. Ben, I think you could say there's a similar spectrum when it comes to content, right?
Absolutely. The same notion applies to content. While PowerPoint and PDFs may be fine in a pinch or for compliance scenarios, as a vehicle for actual learning, we know that they are highly ineffective. Providing more interactive content not only makes learning more engaging, it also makes it much more memorable. While you no longer have the advantage of meeting face-to-face with your learners, it is critical that your content encourage better connectivity. PowerPoint, PDF, and other forms of traditional content are inherently limited. Their static, flat nature restricts user interaction to page turning and scrolling, which in turn hampers the ability to achieve learning objectives. Modern content allows for true interactivity through the use of flip cards, image carousels, videos, 3D models, interactive quizzes, and much more. It is easily searchable so that it can be referenced at the moment of need. And it's safe to say that modern learning looks a lot more like Google and YouTube than what we see today in most corporate learning environments. So, where to from here? In short, it's time to rethink learning to deliver something that is much better adapted to today's highly dynamic and increasingly agile world. And in many ways, none of this is new. We just find ourselves in a situation where COVID has accelerated the need to act now. The good news is the global learning community has long demonstrated a willingness to innovate and find powerful new ways of learning. So, if ILT is no longer an option, then it is time to find a new way of reaching our learners.
Agreed. So then the question is, what should this new way look like? This is the opportunity to reinvent the way we think about learning. If you recall the end state of the instructor spectrum, we highlighted the effectiveness of interactivity and group exercises, allowing people to try out the skills and techniques as you would want to see them performed in a workplace setting, with the opportunity to receive real-time feedback so they can make corrections and learn. On the content side, we want to address the learner experience and all their expectations they are bringing from their experiences outside learning. There is a demand to be able to quickly and easily access learning resources that has not always been met. And while we've been primarily focused on learners, we also need to think at the organizational level. For organizations, having consistent analytics allows for continuous evaluation of the learning program and surfaces areas that require improvement. Our challenge is to look at these different modalities and merge the two.
So clearly we're in the middle of some big changes, and there are a lot of unknowns. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that we do know. So let's start with that.
So to start off with what we know, ILT is simply not an option. That's been taken away from us, at least for the short term. But we've also learned this year that directly transferring classroom learning to virtual instructor-led training using Zoom or another virtual tool is also not working. You can't take 1 day, 2 day, or 1 week sessions and deliver them as 1 day, 2 day, or 1 week online sessions. Lengthy Zoom sessions are exhausting, and as a result, they are ineffective. Everyone is sitting in a distraction-rich environment at home, which leads to an attention deficit. You're not getting the attention you would have if you took people out of the workplace setting and put them into a classroom. Let's also talk about what we know when it comes to learning organizations and what they are being asked to do. As you are all too well aware, learning organizations are under immense pressure. People are being taken off the various initiatives they are working on, and they're being asked to take a look at existing instructor-led programs and convert them into an undefined something else. But because of all these time pressures and resource constraints, that something else often ends up being the lowest common denominator. It's a PDF, it's a PowerPoint, or it's a dull page-turning web-based training that Ben has been talking about. But there is also a positive here. It's important for us to look at some virtual classroom statistics that predate COVID. Because one thing we know is that virtual classroom training is mainstream. In 2019, 93% of organizations were already using VILT. We also know, on the positive side, that session times have been trending shorter. In 2012, the average session length was 60 to 90 minutes long. But by 2019, that had already dropped to 60 minutes, with 15% of organizations reporting average session times of 45 minutes or less. And finally, people are taking the first step in creating smaller chunks of content and bundling them into a series of learning events. This helps give people a break and better manage their time. They have visibility into the full expectation, but can complete it on a timeline that makes sense for them.
Okay, so clearly just throwing everything over the wall into one-way Zoom sessions is not working. But we still find ourselves under immense pressure to convert existing programs into something new. So if that's right, Nala, then what are some of the next steps that you see people taking? And how do we go about introducing these changes into our organizations? Are you seeing any best practices emerge?
Yes, I think it makes sense for us to focus on 3 things. First, the better use of virtual classroom. Second, re-envisioning blended learning. And third, empowering learners. Let's start with VILT and incorporating techniques to gauge participant understanding and encourage interaction. It may seem obvious, but it needs to be done deliberately. You need to pause often for questions. Sometimes we get on a roll and forget we have learners out there that we need to engage. We also need to pause because of varying bandwidth. Sometimes learners need a little time for the slides to catch up. You also need to build in times to ask participants to share their experiences, provide examples, or expand on various topics. A second technique is to utilize a chat window. You can use chat to collect learner responses, especially when you have a large group, and then draw out a few of those to mention in class. Another technique with the chat window is to capture questions for later follow-up. We also need to proactively schedule breaks. Learners will be less likely to stray if they know that there is planned time to do various things, like getting a drink of water or stretching. A couple other ideas. Remember that less text is more. Keep your bullets succinct and utilize visual representations and images wherever possible. It's easier to absorb the material, and it also makes learning more engaging. Also, leverage the tools that come within the tool that you're using. Things like polls and pop quizzes spot check your learners and make sure they're interacting with you. Using breakout rooms and dividing your attendees into small groups helps with accountability. And whiteboarding really keeps things dynamic and helps break up lecture-style delivery while getting your attendees involved. And lastly, we've had a lot of experience with this over the last months, but make sure and put in some face time. Keep cameras on to keep everyone accountable. They don't have to be on the entire time, but have selected points where you can focus on different learners. So that's VILT. The second area of focus, we need to rethink blended learning. The concept of blended learning was really formulated with instructor-led training as a centerpiece. Learners were asked to read documents or take a quiz prior to the class as prerequisites. This enabled them to come to class with background on the topic or an assessment of their existing knowledge for the instructor to better understand the learner baseline and tailor content appropriately. After the classroom training, there's often a follow-up in the form of a post-class assessment or supplementary resources that learners could optionally consume. So if you think about this like a meal, the prerequisites are the appetizer, the instructor-led training is the main course, and the post-class follow-up is the dessert. The challenge that we have today is that our entree has been taken away. And instead of replacing it with a different entree, we need to replace it with tapas. So instead of replacing that porterhouse steak with a roasted chicken, we're getting a bunch of small plates and putting them together to get our meal. The point is, we are not replacing 8 hours of in-person training with 8 hours of something else. We need to replace it with smaller, deliberate chunks of self-directed learning interspersed with touch points to allow for interaction with instructors and subject matter experts. So what does this look like? When planning out delivery, keep in mind that while you may have been able to accomplish traditional classroom training in 2 days, virtual classroom segments should be kept much shorter and incorporate and embed self-paced modules for your learners to complete on their own schedules. Even though the training hours may be the same, more calendar time needs to be allocated to completing the curriculum. You can also offer pre-session coaching or post-session follow-up sessions with key stakeholders from the session, much like college office hours with a professor. This is a great way to ensure accessibility and provide additional help and performance support when needed. And not to beat a dead horse, but VILT sessions that are part of blended learning need to be purposeful. Short, interactive sessions take lots of planning. Identify a discrete set of points you want to get across and proactively plan the way your participants are going to interact and get engaged. And lastly, we need to empower our learners. When we talked about the instructor spectrum earlier, the more effective sessions were those where learners were engaged and interacting, and when the instructor was facilitating rather than delivering the content. This is key to our new model. Learners need to feel empowered to find the learning they need to do their jobs and grow their careers. Taking this a few steps further, learners should be able to choose their own adventure. You'll always need to have mandatory components, but offer more for those who want to take the next step. And then lastly, provide ongoing performance support. Make learning continuous instead of just that moment in time where training is scheduled. Using coaching and other follow-up activities will help with this.
Agreed. And when it comes to engaging and empowering learners, I love this quote from Jason Morgan at Hike Vision. Don't be afraid to step outside of the box and try something new. The average learner today is not the average learner that we dealt with 20 years ago. The engagement that you can get out of an employee might surprise you.
So given what we have learned so far regarding delivery of sessions and use of more effective techniques, what are our next steps?
Well, first, it's clearly time to shift our focus from learning as an event to learning as a capability. Another way of thinking about this is the idea of bringing the learning to the learner instead of the learner to the learning. What is today increasingly being referred to as learning in the flow of work. As Nyla noted, the traditional learning model focuses on lecture and perhaps a test, and then we hold that up as proof that the learner mastered the material. We track course completions and assessment scores as key metrics. But this all too often is a big distraction from really driving effective performance because people aren't given the opportunity to apply what they learned, so quickly forget what they were taught and are unable to apply it at the moment of need. This model also slows everything down. What is needed is a mind shift where we begin to shift our focus from just creating learning events to enabling what at Inkling we refer to as learning at work speed. To do this, we need to empower employees with capabilities and opportunities that mirror methods that we all use in our everyday lives. Again, models like Google and YouTube that follow the find, learn, do model.
Our challenge is to take the best of classroom learning and the best part of self-paced learning to create the equivalent of what the smartphone is to communication, going back to the analogy that we started with. Just like the smartphone combined oral and written communication into one device, we need to take the two modalities of instructor-led training and self-paced online learning to create what will be the learning of the future. Classroom learning will survive, but we need to think about it differently and use that modality when it is an available and appropriate option.
According to a recent report on COVID impacts from the Fosway Group, 71% of organizations have experienced an increased demand for digital learning from end users, but traditional e-learning shows signs of waning both in terms of adoption and perceived success. So, in many ways, we are at a pivotal moment for learning and operations professionals where we can change the conversation around learning and move it from a process that is reactive to a capability that can be used to drive agility into the business. To give just one source of inspiration, Taco Bell invested in future-proofing their learning initiatives many years ago and now uses Inkling to launch a new menu item every 6 weeks to over 7,500 restaurants nationwide. This modernized approach to learning has not only allowed them to leverage learning as a capability, it has also empowered team members and dramatically improved customer satisfaction along the way. In times like these, this ability for the business to pivot on a dime is more critical than ever.
All right. Fantastic. Well, hopefully this was an interesting session for folks. We've had a lot of questions coming in as we've gone along here, so we're going to jump to those in a minute. But if you haven't had a chance to send us your questions, please take a minute to do that. You can do that using the Q&A function. We'll keep an eye on those as they come in. Any questions we don't get to, we will be sure to follow up with you individually. All right. So, question here, Nyla, looks like it is. For you, people are very curious. You've done this, you've been at this for a while. And people are wondering, what type of governance model would you recommend to support this type of initiative?
So, first of all, a governance model is absolutely necessary. So I think it's good that this person's already thinking that a governance model will be step one in terms of getting this in place. So there's always a lot of questions in terms of when do you use different modalities, and without specific guidance, people can go out and just start buying all kinds of content and buying tools to develop content and, really do things differently and on their own. So I think giving that guidance to groups that narrows down the scope of, what tools you can use and providing some guidelines to help determine in what situations you would, provide a document rather than develop microlearning, or when microlearning is appropriate rather than some, more robust, longer web-based training, really helps just in terms of consistency across the organization. And it gives people sort of a playbook to work through rather than doing it on their own. More broadly, I think it also helps to give guidelines around what recommended blended learning should look like. If for nothing else, then to start creating that expectation for all of your learners that, when they embark upon a set of learning or a learning event, they know what different pieces are going to be a part of it, regardless of what department in your organization is producing that learning. Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
Makes absolute sense. I think it may be more of a question. So there's, when it comes to governance models, right, you've also sort of run into situations where, the extent to which things are really completely centralized, or whether the governance model itself allows for some sort of decentralization, whether that's, into different brands, if that's the way your organization is structured, or perhaps it's just within, down to sort of individual departments. Any thoughts or sort of best practices that you see around that?
Well, I would say that, the difficulty with trying to centralize and control everything is look at the pace that our industries are changing and how quickly, things are evolving. So when a product is changing, or when a service that is being provided is changing, or, to your example, when a menu item is changing, you can't start at the top of the governance model and, push everything down. So I think there needs to be some level of autonomy that, whether it's facilities, locations, functions, stores, they have to have something that enables them to continue doing their work as everything around them changes. So
Agreed.
I think some level of decentralization is going to be necessary.
Yeah, agreed 100%. And I think that's sort of one thing that's interestingly sort of come out of COVID is people realized that the more centralized your models were, the more difficult it was for the organization in general to sort of respond and be very agile in its response. And so I think it's interesting as you consider your governance model, and first, making sure that you have one, but then also thinking about that model and how how much of that governance process can you push down and how far. And I think what that will quickly take you to are, what are some of the supporting tools, not just processes, but sort of some of the supporting tools that you need to put in place so that people have that flexibility, but with some guardrails, right? So that as they need to quickly redevelop content or reissue content, for example, that they're doing that in a way that's on brand and that's consistent, and that they're that they can operate sort of autonomously, but make sure that they're quote unquote sort of getting it right, at scale and quickly, right? So I think the process is important, but the tools are equally important. Great. Okay, next question. Seems like it's actually maybe even a bit related. So how does ILT fit into a world where content is increasingly disposable? And then how do you make the decision as to what will be ILT?
So let's take a really broad definition of ILT here. Obviously there's the bring everyone into a classroom and disseminate information and then they just go away ILT. But, to stretch the definition a little bit, there's also the instructor that is working with a small group or maybe even working one-on-one. And I get that we normally call that, coaching or observation, but, just for the purposes of this discussion, I think it's a mistake to think that you can eliminate all individual or, personal in-person contact. That just doesn't make sense. But maybe if we look at this question in the reverse, because traditionally this is how it happened, right? Everyone was attending classroom sessions, and then there was an analysis of, okay, what pieces of the instructor-led session can we remove and deliver through web-based training? And, the result of that was there's a lot of just kind of knowledge that needs to be dispersed, not necessarily memorization of, these three pieces do this one thing, but anything that is really knowledge-based, where the answer, it's definitive, there's not a lot of discussion or different ways to do things, that is more readily distributed in another medium. You don't need instructor-led training for that. But if you need to demonstrate something to someone and then have them demonstrate it back to make sure they need it, you can get some of that through, simulation tools. I've seen that, done well in some industries, but that's where that personal, hey, I'm watching you do this right now, try it this way instead, or you missed this piece, and being able to give that real-time feedback as someone's actually doing something. I don't think as we consider blended learning that those pieces should be removed.
Yes, agreed. Right. I think another sort of lens maybe to even look at that through is, okay, which we know of the training, the different potential programs you could deliver, right? Which of those are most closely tied to kind of the performance of the organization, right? And then within those, which pieces really need to be, to your earlier points, Nyla, right? Experiential. Right? What are the components that where people actually need to do it hands-on, and you would ideally want to sort of witness them doing it hands-on? And I think through those two lenses, right? First, like what's mission critical, right? And then within that set of content, what actually needs to be done, right? Or has an experiential component, and maybe focus on those perhaps as the pieces that you would prioritize as your at least your priority initiatives.
Right.
All right. Love this next question. So how do you balance choose your own adventure learning with making sure folks know what they need to know?
I like this one too. Especially for those of us who are attending today who are performance managers, and you have these conversations where your direct reports have lots of varied interests and want to learn new skills, and how do you guide them appropriately? So choose your own adventure should not be open season for just go to some catalog with lots of third-party content and pick whatever you want and go for it. I think, we still have the responsibility of channeling people in the right direction, because if their ultimate goal is to advance their careers within your organization, then we want to make sure that the learning they pick and the experiences they select are advancing that goal. So the choose your own adventure part starts with organizations creating appropriate channels and making very visible what skills you're looking for as you move from role to role, and then what training is available that relates to that. And so the choose your own adventure part should already be when they're pointed in the right direction, but then have different choices for maybe specialty within that role, or additional resources for the people who are really interested in digging deep into a specific topic. But we don't want it just to be a free-for-all. It still needs to be guided in some way so that people are not unknowingly spending a lot of time on learning that's not going to necessarily advance their careers.
Yeah, agreed, 100%. Agreed 100%. There's actually, I think, sort of a related question here. It talks a bit about maybe some of the technology behind that, right? So, right now, obviously, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of buzz around newer, technologies, learning experience platforms, a lot of buzz around learning experience platforms that tend to focus on exactly that, right? It's sort of the self-development type of learning. There, clearly you could have other sort of off-the-shelf content in there as well. But how do you balance that, right, with kind of, again, back to the day-to-day, right? How do you make sure that people are also sort of getting, the learning that they need to sort of run the day-to-day, right? The operational stuff that they need to know to run the business day-to-day.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's the danger of just making a catalog blindly available. So there's a lot of appeal in, if I set up this LXP and I have all of this third-party content, people can really find what they want. They can be on their merry way. But in reality, and that's true, and that can be seen as a benefit, as employees are progressing through your organization, or even as a recruiting tool, that you make this available. However, I think that it's more productive for your organization in terms of attaining organizational goals, and it's better for the individuals that you're hiring to put more guidance around it in terms of what is it that your organization is really looking for. If you look at the various paths that an individual can take in your organization, let's say they're at level 1, and there are 3 or 4 roles that you would traditionally go to from that level or from that position. What is the training that is going to help support the skill development to get them in one of those directions? Like, if we don't give them that guidance, then there's a possibility of using your organization's resources in a way that's not going to ultimately benefit you or them.
Agreed. And we talked about this a bit, earlier on in the presentation, but to me, at least, I think the key is just being very, very clear, right? I mean, make sure that people are super crystal clear on exactly where they're meant to go for those different sources of information, right? So, where do I go for all of this self-directed kind of personal development type stuff, and where do I go for all the day-to-day run the business stuff? And that needs to be 100% crystal clear. If there's a single system that's the front door, that's fine, but make sure that once they're through that front door, that it's again, crystal clear where they would go for one versus the other. Or perhaps, you're going to have 2 different front doors, right? You go here for self-development, and you go here for, how to run the day-to-day operations. But as long as that's crystal clear, I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point in
Here's
terms of giving direction if there are multiple systems on which one is used for what purpose.
Exactly. I mean, I think the risk, and if I'm reading kind of between the lines of the question here, it's just sort of how you prevent people from kind of being lost in that sea of information we talked about.
Yeah.
All right. Well, here's a layup of a question. Can I get a copy of the slides? Absolutely. I think we will be making those available. In fact, I think the recording itself will also be available immediately after the session, so that won't be a problem. Another good question here. So, talk a bit about how you can increase enrollment in any scenario. It's been a bit of a struggle both pre and post-pandemic.
So, I guess, in terms of enrollment, I'm assuming that means registering for any type of training, whether it's online or downloading an asset or virtual learning. There's a lot of factors that go into enrollment and engagement. And from a macro perspective, it could be organizational culture, industry culture, where, especially in the middle of a pandemic, if there are so many other things that have been prioritized and people are just spent trying to meet their day-to-day obligations, that training isn't getting prioritized. It could be, from a content perspective, if the inventory of content requires you to sit down for a 2-hour span to take web-based training, but the breaks that you have are only 20 minutes long, then sometimes people just feel discouraged by that, and instead of even starting it, they just don't do it at all. Kind of like me in working out. But I do think that it's worth looking at the type of content that's being offered, and it could be that, maybe looking at microlearning, if it is a time issue, or is it an access issue? In the rush to convert training from instructor-led into web-based, a lot of times we just took the slides that we had and kind of threw them into a template and automated it with tracking and threw it out there. And maybe if a person's trying to do this on their phone, it's just untenable. So I think looking at the modalities, looking at the length, and then to some of the earlier discussion, ensuring that people understand which training that you offer is directly relevant to the jobs that they are doing. I think looking at those things could help with that engagement and increase enrollment.
Yeah,
Ben, did you have any thoughts
I
on
agree.
that?
I agree 100%. I wonder if actually that's sort of not actually just an indication of some of exactly what you were talking about, right? Those declining enrollment numbers might be reflective of sort of the decline in sort of the effectiveness of instructor-led training, period, right? And not that the not that instructor-led training is going away as we talked about, but that basically it needs to be sort of repurposed, right, and reimagined in terms of what's being handled in those sessions, right? If, to take an example, that content's not keeping up with the business, right? We all know that the businesses are moving at an increasingly sort of accelerated pace. If by the time they get into that session's either too long or worse almost, that they get into that session and the content's not current, right? It's not up to date. They're not getting the value, and you're not going to see sort of return attendance. The other sort of along those same lines, right? To me, this raises, I think, I'm personally sort of very interested in this idea. I think the idea of kind of flipping the classroom has been around for a while. It's not necessarily new, but I do believe that it's something that all of a sudden became sort of big bang, more interesting, more relevant with COVID, right? And again, it's the basic idea of what content can we move out of the classroom into smaller, bite-sized, micro-learning, as you said, chunks, reformatting it, right, turning it into videos or turning it into sort of more interactive, bite-sized content, but getting it out of the classroom and moving it into sort of like the minutes that people have throughout the day, and then refocusing rather that shoulder-to-shoulder time around the experiential component, right? So to maybe take an example, you're in the hotel management business, instead of having a session where people are there for an hour learning the whole entire nuts to bolts process around how to check in a guest and best practices around that, et cetera, you push all of that, all those best practices and the sort of policies and procedures into sort of bite-sized videos. And then you have a session which is much, much smaller, where perhaps even instead of individuals, you have teams coming together and they're doing it, right? They're actually checking the person in start to finish, versus learning how to do it. They're actually doing it, right? And that's the whole idea of flipping the classroom. Get what I need to know out of the classroom, and then focus the time that you have together around the actual experiential component of doing whatever it is you need to do. Same thing, IT security is very kind of traditionally dull content. It's not super exciting stuff. What if we can have people taking smaller bite-sized videos or whatever the case may be around best practices, what is a good password, what are our policies around some of these things, and then actually using the quote-unquote instructor-led training component to set up that person's laptop, have them create their accounts, and have them set their passwords. So you can think of lots of different, you can apply that to your own worlds and sort of think about how you would tease out the pieces that could be moved into smaller bite-sized chunks they can learn outside of the classroom, and then how would I refocus that time, the valuable time that we have together around the experiential components. All right, I think we're close to the end of our time here. At least one more question maybe we can hit. sort of a question around sort of team learning versus individual learning, if you're seeing any shifts there. I think we all would agree that historically, learning has been very focused on how do I teach individuals things, right? How do I, improve Joe Smith's skills around a particular topic? And I think increasingly people are thinking around, teams instead. How would I, train the team versus the individual? I don't know if that's something now that you're seeing any trends around, or sort of any, and what your thoughts are just generally around that.
I'm seeing a lot of the individual needing to be responsible for their own training. So it's almost like the individual teaching the individual. And the people that are putting in that time to develop themselves are the ones that are, ready for that next task, or, getting tapped for the next responsibility. I've seen a lot of, especially in the organizations that we're working with now, a lot of people raising their hand to say, okay, here's something I've always been interested in, maybe I'll try that. But there's also a lot of people who are just treading water and trying to stay on top of what they need to do. So I haven't seen a ton of the team training, unless it's people doing, like, a group of people doing the exact same task. Have you seen that?
Right. I think it's definitely sort of like an emerging trend. I think people are trying to sort of get their arms around how do I focus, instead of, again, it's maybe this shift from kind of individual skills in the micro to sort of more, leveling up, right? So teaching to the job, right? What does it look like to be a good, role X, Y, Z, versus, like, forget about Java, right? What does it look like to be a good IT manager? And sort of, I think there's definitely been a shift from sort of the skill to kind of more of the capabilities around a role. And this maybe is sort of the next evolution of that. Like, how do I, how do I run a hotel effectively, and what does that look like end to end from across my teams, and how do I sort of teach the team so there's a broader understanding of kind of the different roles and who's doing what, and versus sort of me focusing just on what I'm focused on.
Got it.
I have a
more holistic
view of things.
Yeah.
And I think people
I would
are just
say, from a cohort perspective, I've definitely seen more interest in that. But again, a lot of this is pushing the training away from the instructor just saying, this is what you're going to do, and giving more responsibility to the learners or employees themselves to collaborate and come up with solutions and give each other feedback.
Agreed. All right. Well, I think that takes us up to the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for all the questions. Apologize if we didn't get to every single one of them. Like I said, we will try and get back to anyone who we missed. I want to especially thank Nyla for her time today. I really appreciate it. I think it was, we find ourselves in very interesting and challenging times, and I think a lot of folks, as we said at the beginning of the webinar, are really trying to get their arms around this, but there are some emerging thoughts and best practices, and we did our best to kind of share some of those with you today. So hopefully this was helpful. Nyla, any closing thoughts?
Thank you all for your participation, and we will definitely make those slides available.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.